Before sugar plums became something people vaguely imagined as tiny Christmas candies dancing through a poem, they were a real confection, and the real Victorian version was much stranger, harder, and more exhausting than most modern recipes admit. Today, if you search for sugar plums, you usually find little no-bake balls made from dried fruit, nuts, honey, and spices, rolled in sugar like a holiday energy bite. Those can be delicious, but they are not really the old Victorian sugar plum that people were talking about in the 19th century. A real sugar plum was closer to a comfit or a dragée, the same family as Jordan almonds, a small fruit, seed, spice, or nut slowly coated in layer after layer of sugar until it became a hard, glossy little candy. And the most surprising part is that the word plum did not always mean the fruit. In older confectionery language, a plum could simply mean something small, round, and sweet. So when Victorian children dreamed of sugar plums, they were not necessarily dreaming of actual plums. They were dreaming of tiny luxury candies built one sugary shell at a time. That is why real Victorian sugar plums were not usually made casually in a home kitchen. They took patience, equipment, heat, drying time, and the kind of repetitive labor that makes you understand why people bought them from professional confectioners. One 19th century method used preserved cherries as the center, which already tells you something important. The candy begins with something sticky, delicate, and fruity, but the real work is not the fruit. The real work is the shell. First, the cherries had to be dried so they were not wet enough to ruin the coating. Then they were tossed in fine sugar, dried again, and prepared for the slow process of building layers. To help the sugar cling, confectioners used gum arabic, a natural plant gum that becomes sticky when mixed with water. It worked like edible glue. A little gum mixture would coat the fruit, then powdered sugar would be added, then the fruit would dry, then another layer would go on, and another, and another. If that sounds simple, imagine doing it for hours while trying to keep every little cherry from sticking to its neighbors, clumping into a sugary disaster, or turning into one ugly lump. That is the secret of sugar plums. They sound magical, but the process is basically controlled impatience. You are trying to make sugar behave. The next stage was even more intense. Once the fruit had a beginning crust, a thick sugar syrup could be made and added in tiny amounts while the candies tumbled. This is called panning. Today, candy factories use rotating pans to make things like Jordan almonds, jelly bean shells, and chocolate candies with smooth coatings. But before modern machinery made it easy, panning was slow, skilled work. The candies had to keep moving while syrup was drizzled over them. Add too much syrup and they stick together. Add too little and nothing happens. Let them dry too fast and the surface gets rough. Let them dry too slowly and they clump. The goal was to build a hard shell one layer at a time until the candy became smooth, round, and sturdy. A single layer was not enough. Real sugar plums needed many layers, sometimes enough to turn a small cherry into a polished little sweet that looked almost more like a bead than a piece of fruit. This is why sugar plums were associated with luxury. Sugar itself was once expensive, and even after it became more available, turning it into fine candy still required time and skill. A sugar plum was not just a snack. It was a little symbol of refinement, patience, and money. That also helps explain why the phrase sugar plum became so powerful in Christmas culture. In A Visit from St. Nicholas, better known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, children have visions of sugar plums dancing in their heads. That line has survived for 2 centuries, partly because it sounds mysterious. Most people know the phrase, but not the object. It feels like Christmas magic because we do not quite know what we are picturing. But if you were a 19th century child, a sugar plum was not just a cute word. It meant a special sweet, something bright, hard, sugary, and probably not eaten every day. The Nutcracker later made the idea even more dreamlike with the sugar plum fairy, turning a real candy into a symbol of fantasy, elegance, and Christmas wonder. But the real candy was much more physical than the fantasy. It was sticky fingers, hot syrup, drying trays, gum arabic, and repeated coatings. It was not a fairy, it was labor. And that is what makes it fascinating. Victorian sugar plums sit right at the intersection of childhood imagination and industrial food history. They remind us that old-fashioned candy was not automatically simpler than modern candy. Sometimes it was more complicated. Today we think of factory candy as artificial and old candy as handmade and rustic. But sugar plums complicate that idea. They were handmade, yes, but they were also highly technical. They depended on temperature, timing, texture, crystallization, and surface control. In other words, they were food science wearing a Christmas costume. And the ingredients sound almost oddly modern. Preserved fruit, sugar syrup, gum arabic, food coloring, flavoring like rose water or orange blossom water, and enough patience to question your life choices. The finished candy could be white or colored, plain or glossy, delicate or hard. It could surround a cherry, a nut, or another small center. But the core idea was always the same. Take something small and coat it again and again until sugar transforms it. That transformation is the whole story. A cherry becomes a jewel, syrup becomes shell, labor becomes luxury, and a difficult confection becomes a childhood dream. Modern dried fruit sugar plum recipes are not worthless. They are just a different branch of the same holiday tree. Those fruit and nut balls probably became popular because they are easier, faster, and closer to what a modern home cook can actually make without buying a panning machine or spending 3 days babysitting cherries. They also taste more like what people expect from a Christmas treat: warm spices, figs, dates, prunes, nuts, honey, citrus, maybe a little brandy. But calling those the original sugar plums hides the stranger truth. The real Victorian version was less like a cookie tray and more like candy engineering. And honestly, that makes the story better. Because the phrase sugar plum sounds soft and gentle, but the actual process is stubborn and demanding. It is one of those historical foods that proves the past was not always simpler. People in the past were willing to do absurd amounts of work for beauty, status, and sweetness. They would dry cherries for hours, coat them with gum, toss them in sugar, tumble them in syrup, dry them overnight, add more layers, add color, and then finally serve a candy that could disappear in one bite. That is both ridiculous and completely human. We still do the same thing today, just with different technology. We turn simple ingredients into status symbols. We make food beautiful enough to photograph. We buy candy not only because it tastes good, but because it feels seasonal, nostalgic, and special. Victorian sugar plums did all of that before social media, before supermarket candy aisles, and before Christmas became the giant commercial machine we know now. They were tiny, edible performances. The performance began with sugar, but it ended with imagination. That is why the phrase survived even after most people forgot the candy itself. The object disappeared, but the dream stayed. So if you want to make real Victorian sugar plums, the honest answer is this: prepare for a project, not a quick recipe. You need a center, like preserved cherries. You need to dry them. You need gum arabic to help build the first shell. You need fine sugar, thick syrup, repeated coating, drying time, and ideally some kind of tumbling setup so the candies can move while the layers form. You need to resist the temptation to pour on too much syrup at once, because sugar rewards patience and punishes greed. And after all that, you get something small, hard, sweet, and strangely beautiful. Not a soft fruit ball, not a modern health snack, not a vague Christmas metaphor. A real sugar plum. A candy that explains why old confectioners were part cooks, part chemists, and part magicians. And maybe that is the best way to understand Victorian sugar plums. They were not magical because they were easy. They were magical because they took something ordinary and buried it under so many careful layers of sweetness that it became a little object of wonder. That is the real history hiding inside the Christmas phrase. The sugar plum was never just sugar. And it was never just plum. It was labor, luxury, science, memory, and fantasy, all rolled into one tiny candy that somehow danced its way into Christmas forever.